The bustling chaos of Los Angeles International Airport was in full swing. Passengers rushing past, suitcase wheels clattering against the tiled floor, and the constant hum of announcements echoing through the terminals. Amid this whirlwind of motion stood a man in the first-class line, calm and unbothered, as if insulated from the frenzy around him. Keanu Reeves, dressed in a faded plaid shirt, jeans that had clearly seen better days, and scuffed boots, carried a well-worn backpack slung over his shoulder. His unassuming presence seemed almost out of place amidst the tailored suits, luxury handbags, and air of exclusivity surrounding him. Despite his modest appearance, there was something quietly magnetic about Keanu, an air of tranquility that made him stand apart, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't. His eyes scanned the scene around him, not with impatience, but with an almost meditative curiosity, as if he were soaking in the moment. Behind him, in line, stood Elliot Carter, a man who couldn't have been more different. His sharp navy suit clung to him perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. A luxury watch gleamed on his wrist, and the faint scent of an expensive cologne lingered as he adjusted his tie. For Elliot, every detail mattered. Appearances were everything, and first class wasn't just a seat, it was a statement. Elliot's gaze fell on Keanu, lingering a little too long. The contrast was almost laughable to him. After a moment, he leaned forward just enough to make his voice carry but still maintain an air of casual indifference. "First class, huh?" he said, the faintest smirk curling his lips. "You never know who they'll let in these days." Keanu turned slightly, meeting Elliot's eyes with a calm, steady gaze. His expression didn't change, and his voice was soft but resolute as he replied, "The world is full of surprises." The simplicity of the response seemed to catch Elliot off guard. He straightened his posture, his smirk faltering ever so slightly, before chuckling under his breath. "Yeah, surprises," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The boarding announcement broke through the tension, calling first-class passengers to step forward. Keanu moved ahead with quiet purpose, his steps unhurried, his demeanor as steady as ever. Behind him, Elliot followed, his mind already calculating how to assert his dominance in what he saw as a mismatched situation. Neither man knew it yet, but what started as a fleeting moment of judgment would soon unravel into a lesson neither would forget. As they entered the plane and approached their seats, Elliot's eyes widened slightly in disbelief. His ticket directed him to the seat right next to Keanu. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if life had just played a cruel joke on him. "You've got to be kidding me," Elliot muttered, sliding into his seat with exaggerated reluctance. Of all the people I could end up sitting next to. Keanu, already settled, looked at him with the same calm expression he'd worn earlier. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said politely, his voice carrying no trace of sarcasm or irritation. Elliot crossed his arms, leaning back in his seat, his discomfort palpable. He glanced over at Keanu's scuffed boots and worn backpack, his judgment clear in his narrowed eyes. The stark contrast between them was like a splinter under his skin, one he couldn't ignore. The plane began to fill with passengers, and the buzz of conversation grew around them. Keanu, unfazed, adjusted his backpack beneath the seat and gazed out the window, as though the world beyond the glass held more interest than anything inside the cabin. Elliot wasn't about to let the moment pass in silence. "So," he began, his tone casual but edged with condescension, "what do you do for a living?" Keanu turned his attention back to him, his demeanor unchanged. "I work in film," he replied simply. Elliot raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Film, huh? What, like commercials? Indie projects?" Keanu's slight smile didn't waver. "Something like that," he said, his tone neither defensive nor boastful. Elliot leaned forward, emboldened by what he assumed was a lack of confidence. You know, flying first class isn't just about the ticket price, he said, his voice dropping as though he were sharing a secret. It's about being part of a certain circle. You have to earn your place here, you get what I'm saying? Keanu held his gaze for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. I think everyone earns their place in one way or another, he replied, his words measured and deliberate. Elliot leaned back, with a short laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing the comment. Sure, but let's be honest. Some places are just out of reach for certain people. Keanu turned back to the window, saying nothing. His silence seemed to unsettle Elliot, who was clearly expecting a reaction. Around them, a few passengers began to notice the tension. Quiet glances were exchanged, the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere impossible to ignore. The flight attendant approached, beginning the in-flight service. Elliot, ever the performer, made his presence known. Champagne, please, he said with a confident smile. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. When it was Keanu's turn, he made a simple request. Just water, thank you. Elliot let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. Water? He asked, leaning slightly toward Keanu. You're in first class, and you're drinking water? Come on, man. Live a little. Keanu accepted the bottle from the flight attendant with a nod of thanks. Sometimes, simplicity is enough, he said quietly, taking a sip. Elliot narrowed his eyes, studying him as if trying to decode an enigma. He smirked again, unwilling to let the conversation end. Yeah, I guess simplicity works. For people who settle for less. Keanu didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. Then, turning back to Elliot, he said, softly, maybe the best things in life are different for everyone. The cabin grew quieter as the exchange continued. Some passengers discreetly tuned in, their curiosity piqued by the clash of personalities. Elliot, sensing the attention, leaned forward again, determined to steer the conversation back into his favor. You know what I've noticed? He said, his tone dripping with mock insight. People who talk about simplicity and humility usually say that because they can't afford better. It's like sour grapes, you know. Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable but undeniably calm. I've noticed, he replied, that the people who talk the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words struck like a quiet thunderclap. Elliot blinked, momentarily stunned, his smirk faltering. Around them, passengers exchanged knowing glances. Some nodded subtly, while others turned away, pretending not to listen but clearly invested in the unfolding drama. For a brief moment, Elliot seemed unsure of what to say. But then, with a forced laugh, he leaned back in his seat, his confidence wavering just enough to betray the impact of Keanu's words. He was starting to realize that this wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to controlling. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The flight had taken off, and the cabin settled into a calm hum of conversations, clinking glasses, and the occasional rustle of newspapers. Keanu remained quiet, his focus on the view outside the window. The serenity he radiated seemed to make Elliot even more restless. Elliot adjusted his seatbelt, tapping his fingers on the armrest. He glanced at Keanu, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. You know, he began, his voice cutting through the silence. Life is a lot like flying first class. You work hard, earn your place, and then you get to enjoy the rewards. But some people... He paused for effect, smirking slightly. Some people only end up here because they get lucky. Keanu turned to face him, his expression as composed as ever. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his lap. Luck or hard work, he said, his tone serene yet firm. We all land in the same place when the flight ends, don't we? Elliot blinked, taken aback by the simplicity and depth of the statement. For a moment he said nothing, his smirk fading. Around them, a few passengers had begun to listen more intently, their gazes shifting between the two men. "Well," Elliot finally replied, forcing a laugh, "some of us land at higher levels. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering his words. "I think the value of being here," he said, gesturing subtly around the cabin, "isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. A couple of passengers exchanged approving glances, while others nodded, subtly. Elliot, however, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the confidence he had projected earlier beginning to falter. He laughed again, but it sounded hollow. "That's a good one," he said, his tone dripping with forced sarcasm. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should write a book." Keanu didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to the window. The silence that followed was more deafening than any response he could have given. Elliot, unwilling to let the conversation die, tried again. "You know what's funny?" he said, leaning slightly toward Keanu. "The people who preach humility and simplicity are usually the ones who don't have much to show for themselves. Ever notice that?" Keanu turned to him, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I've noticed," he said softly, "that sometimes the people who talk the loudest about what they have are the ones who feel the most empty inside." The cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the air itself had thickened with tension. Elliot froze for a moment, his jaw tightening. His fingers fiddled absently with his watch, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in deeper than he wanted to admit. After a long pause, Elliot forced a smile. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm not trying to be rude. It's just, the world's competitive. If you don't show people what you've got, they'll ignore you. That's just how it works." Keanu nodded slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Maybe," he said, "but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." The simplicity of the statement struck a chord, and Elliot couldn't hide the flicker of doubt that crossed his face. Around them, a few passengers exchanged knowing looks, their silent judgments clear. The once confident businessman, so eager to dominate the conversation, now seemed smaller, his bravado cracking under the weight of his own insecurities. As the flight attendant passed by to collect empty glasses, Elliot leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms in a defensive posture. But despite his outward confidence, the shift in the cabin's energy was undeniable. The passengers who had overheard the exchange now viewed him differently, their subtle glances betraying a quiet disapproval. Elliot could feel it. For the first time in a long time, he was unsure of his place. Not just in this conversation, but in the grander scheme of things. And as the plane soared through the sky, the man who had entered the cabin so certain of his superiority was beginning to question everything he thought he knew. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something deeper, a confrontation with himself that he hadn't seen coming. And the quiet man sitting next to him, the one he had underestimated so completely, was at the center of it all. The flight moved into its steady rhythm, but the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Passengers who had initially ignored the quiet exchange between Keanu and Elliot were now silently observing. Elliot, aware of the attention but unwilling to lose face, adjusted his posture and leaned toward Keanu with a thin smile. "You know," Elliot began, swirling the last remnants of champagne in his glass, "some people spend their whole lives talking about humility. But if we're being honest, humility doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't get you here." He gestured broadly at the luxurious surroundings, his tone dripping with self-assurance. Keanu turned to him, his calm eyes meeting Elliot's sharp gaze. "You're right," he said, his voice even. "Humility doesn't pay the bills, but it can remind us what really matters." Elliot raised an eyebrow, chuckling softly. "What really matters?" he echoed, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Come on. What matters is success, power, and respect. Without those, you're just another face in the crowd." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Respect," he said, letting the word linger. "Is it something we demand, or something we earn by how we treat others?" The question seemed simple, but it cut through the cabin like a sharp blade. A few passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity deepening. Elliot, on the other hand, scoffed, leaning back in his seat with a forced laugh. "That's idealistic," he said, his tone dismissive. "In the real world, respect goes to the loudest voice, the one who can prove they belong." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe," he said softly. "But I've found that the loudest voices are often the ones trying to drown out their own doubts." The words hit like a quiet storm. Elliot's confident facade faltered for a split second, his smirk fading. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself momentarily speechless. Around them, the subtle tension was palpable. After a pause, Elliot forced himself to speak. "Look, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being humble," he said, his voice quieter now. "But people like me, we've had to fight for everything. Success doesn't just come to you. You have to take it." Keanu leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. "I understand that," he said. "But sometimes, in the fight to prove ourselves, we forget to ask why we're fighting in the first place. What are we trying to prove? And to whom?" Elliot's fingers tightened around the armrest, his expression hardening. You think you've got me all figured out, don't you?" he said, his voice edged with defensiveness. Keanu shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I don't know your story. But I know that chasing something external can't always fill what's missing inside." For the first time, Elliot didn't have a retort. He sat back, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. His hands fidgeted slightly, and he glanced down at the gold wedding band on his finger, twisting it absently. The action seemed almost unconscious, but it didn't go unnoticed by Keanu, who remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. The tension was broken when the flight attendant approached. She smiled at Keanu and spoke in a hushed, respectful tone. "Mr. Reeves, the captain wanted me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards." The name Reeves seemed to echo in the cabin. A murmur spread among the passengers as recognition dawned on several faces. Elliot froze, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Reeves?" he repeated under his breath, his voice almost a whisper. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant, thanking her before turning back to Elliot. His expression remained calm, as if completely unaware of the ripple his name had caused. Elliot, however, was visibly shaken. He sat back, his gaze locked on Keanu, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Finally, he managed a weak laugh. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't realize who you were." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "Does knowing my name change the truth of what we talked about?" he asked. "Respect, humility, kindness. They don't depend on who someone is. They depend on how we choose to treat each other." Elliot fell silent, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the conversation settled over him. The passengers around them, who had been watching discreetly, exchanged glances of admiration and approval. For the rest of the flight, Elliot didn't say much. He sat quietly, his thoughts seemingly miles away. And while Keanu returned to gazing out the window, the quiet dignity he carried seemed to echo louder than any words could. The cabin settled into a strange stillness. Conversations among other passengers softened to whispers as the weight of the earlier exchange lingered in the air. Elliot sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw clenched and his fingers nervously drumming on the armrest. His mind raced, replaying Keanu's words over and over. He glanced at Keanu, who had returned to his tranquil state, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. The simplicity of his demeanor only deepened the unease in Elliot's chest. It was as though Keanu's calmness illuminated every crack in the confident facade Elliot had carefully constructed. Elliot cleared his throat, forcing himself to break the silence. "You make it sound so easy," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Being content, staying calm. But the world isn't like that. If you don't fight for your place, you'll get left behind." Keanu turned to him, his expression soft but steady. "It's not easy," he said. "Life isn't supposed to be. But sometimes, the fight isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about being at peace with who you are." Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He looked away, his gaze falling to the gold band on his finger. His thumb traced the smooth edge of it absently, a habit he didn't even realize he had. Keanu noticed the movement, but didn't comment. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his tone carrying the same calm strength that had defined him throughout the flight. "You know," he said, "a lot of people spend their lives chasing something, status, money, recognition, thinking it will make them happy. But when they get there, they realize they're still looking for something they can't quite name." Elliot's fingers stilled. He didn't look up, but his shoulders tensed as though the words had struck a nerve. Keanu continued, his voice quiet yet unwavering. "It's not about what you have. It's about what you carry inside. Who you are when no one's watching. That's where real success begins." For the first time, Elliot didn't respond with a smirk or a sarcastic remark. He sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. Around them, the cabin felt almost unnaturally quiet, as if every passenger had been drawn into the gravity of the moment. The flight attendant returned, offering dessert to the passengers. Elliot declined, shaking his head, his appetite gone. Keanu accepted a small dish with a polite smile, thanking her softly. The contrast between them was as stark as ever. One man at peace, the other battling a storm within himself. After a long stretch of silence, Elliot finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "You make it sound like I've been doing it all wrong," he said, almost to himself. Keanu turned to him, his gaze kind but direct. "I'm not saying you've done anything wrong," he said. "We all walk different paths, but sometimes it's worth asking ourselves why we're walking the path we've chosen. What are we hoping to find at the end of it?" Elliot swallowed hard, the question hanging in the air like an echo he couldn't escape. His mind flashed through memories, long nights at the office, strained phone calls with his wife, moments of triumph that had felt hollow the moment they passed. He didn't answer Keanu's question, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes spoke volumes. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Keanu leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as if to rest, while Elliot sat upright, his thoughts too loud to ignore. The tension that had defined their interaction had shifted into something heavier, something introspective. As the plane began its descent, Elliot glanced at Keanu again. There was something different in his expression now. A mixture of respect, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of regret. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but hesitated. The words felt too heavy, too complicated to untangle in such a short span of time. Keanu, sensing the unspoken struggle, offered him a small, reassuring smile. "It's never too late to change direction," he said softly. "Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of clarity." Elliot nodded slowly, his gaze dropping once more to his wedding band. He didn't respond, but the subtle shift in his demeanor was undeniable. As the plane touched down, it was clear that this flight had been more than just a journey from one place to another. For Elliot, it was the beginning of something far deeper, a reckoning with himself. And for everyone who had witnessed the quiet exchange, it was a reminder that true strength doesn't come from what we show the world, but from how we choose to face it. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels gliding along the runway as passengers stirred from their stillness. Seatbelts clicked open, overhead compartments creaked as luggage was pulled down, and the quiet hum of polite exchanges filled the cabin. Keanu remained seated, calmly observing the familiar chaos of disembarkation. Beside him, Elliot fidgeted with his watch, his movements tense and deliberate. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable, more like the aftermath of a storm. Elliot stole a glance at Keanu, the weight of their earlier conversation still pressing on his chest. He hadn't said much since that last exchange, but the questions Keanu had posed echoed in his mind, challenging every assumption he'd built his life on. As the line to exit the plane inched forward, Elliot finally found the courage to speak. "Listen," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I owe you an apology." Keanu turned to him, his expression gentle, his eyes attentive. Elliot exhaled, the words catching in his throat. "Not because of who you are," he clarified, glancing away. "I didn't know that at first, but because I acted like a jerk. I judged you. I assumed things I had no right to assume." Keanu nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But it's a good place to start." Elliot swallowed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I've spent so much of my life trying to prove myself," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "To show the world I belong somewhere, to make people see me. And I guess somewhere along the way I forgot how to just be." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "We all get caught up in the noise," he said, "but it's never too late to listen to what's underneath it." Elliot looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's. There was no judgment there, only understanding. For the first time in a long time, Elliot felt seen, not for what he projected to the world, but for who he was beneath it all. The line moved forward and Keanu stood, pulling his simple backpack from under the seat. As he turned to leave, Elliot stopped him. "Keanu," he said, his voice firm but sincere. "Thank you." Keanu paused, his gaze warm and steady. "Take care, Elliot," he said, offering a faint but genuine smile before stepping into the aisle. Elliot remained seated for a moment, watching as Keanu moved through the cabin with the same unhurried grace he'd had all flight. Passengers turned to greet him, some quietly asking for photos or autographs. Keanu obliged each one with patience and kindness, his actions carrying the same humility that had defined every word he'd spoken. As Elliot finally gathered his belongings and stepped off the plane, he spotted Keanu in the terminal. Fans had begun to approach him, their excitement palpable. Yet even in the midst of the attention, Keanu remained grounded, offering warm smiles, signing autographs with ease, and making every interaction feel personal. Elliot stood back, observing the scene with a newfound perspective. He saw not the movie star, but the man. A man who carried his success quietly, who valued kindness over status, and who had, in a single flight, managed to shift the trajectory of Elliot's life. As he turned to leave, Elliot slipped his phone into his pocket, the need to check messages or emails suddenly feeling trivial. He walked through the terminal with a slower stride, his mind clearer than it had been in years. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot wasn't thinking about what the world saw when they looked at him. He was thinking about what he saw when he looked at himself. Elliot stepped out into the bustling terminal, the weight of the encounter with Keanu still lingering in his chest. Around him, people moved with purpose, some rushing to their next flight, others greeting loved ones with open arms. Yet for Elliot, everything seemed to move in slow motion. He paused near a large glass window overlooking the runway, watching as planes taxied into position. His reflection stared back at him, and for the first time, he truly took a moment to see himself. The suit, the watch, the polished exterior, it all suddenly felt so heavy, like armor he'd been carrying for far too long. Behind him, a faint murmur of excitement caught his attention. He turned to see Keanu standing a short distance away, surrounded by a small group of fans. Some held out notebooks for autographs, others shyly asked for photos. Keanu's demeanor was the same as it had been throughout the flight, calm, present, and entirely unhurried. He took the time to look each person in the eye, offering genuine smiles and quiet words of thanks. Elliot found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The image of Keanu, so effortlessly grounded in the midst of the chaos, felt like a mirror held up to everything Elliot had been running from. One of the fans, a young boy clutching a worn notebook, hesitated as he approached Keanu. His mother stood a few steps behind, encouraging him with a gentle nod. Keanu knelt slightly to meet the boy's eye level, his voice soft but clear. "What's your name?" Keanu asked, his tone warm. "Evan," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu smiled. "That's a great name, Evan. Do you want me to sign this for you?" The boy nodded, his face lighting up as Keanu carefully signed the notebook. "Thank you," Evan said, his small voice full of awe. Keanu placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression kind. "You're welcome. And remember, always be kind. That's what really makes someone strong." Elliot's chest tightened as he watched the exchange. Those simple words echoed the very lesson he'd resisted accepting throughout the flight. Kindness wasn't a weakness. It was strength. And for all his achievements and accolades, Elliot realized he had spent so much time chasing external validation that he'd forgotten to cultivate that strength within himself. As the crowd around Keanu began to thin, Elliot hesitated, unsure if he should approach. His usual confidence, the one he wore like a shield, felt absent, replaced by something unfamiliar: humility. Summoning his courage, he took a step forward, a hand slipping into his pockets. Keanu noticed him almost immediately, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement. I wanted to say thank you," Elliot began, his voice steady but soft. "Not just for what you said back there, but for how you said it. You didn't have to be patient with me, but you were." Keanu tilted his head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Patience isn't always easy," he admitted. "But it's worth it when it helps someone see things a little differently." Elliot nodded, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting Keanu's again. "You made me think," he said, "about the kind of person I've been and the kind of person I want to be." Keanu's expression softened. "That's the first step," he said. "The rest is up to you." Elliot let out a quiet laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I guess I've got some work to do." Keanu extended his hand, his grip firm but kind. "We all do," he said. As Elliot walked away, he felt lighter, not because the questions in his mind had been answered, but because he was finally ready to ask them. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to the world. Instead, he felt a quiet determination to prove something to himself. Keanu watched him go before turning back to the window, the roar of a departing plane filling the air. The world was full of people like Elliot, he thought. People carrying heavy burdens they didn't even realize they were holding. And while he couldn't change the world, he could offer moments like this. Moments where perspective shifted, even if just a little. As Keanu adjusted the strap of his backpack and made his way toward his next gate, a sense of peace followed him. For Elliot, for the passengers who had overheard, and for himself, this wasn't just a flight. It was a reminder of the power of humility, the strength in kindness, and the quiet truth that real success starts within.